Got to do it again. There we go. Is that good? Okay, all right. We want to bring up, let's have a warm welcome for Reverend Anthony Estes, who is over this church here. Let's have a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, esteemed guests, parishioners, friends, and members of our community. It is with heartfelt joy that I welcome each of you to St. Matthew's.
Friends and members of our community.
I sound pretty good. I want to welcome all of you here to St. Matthew's and St. Joseph's Episcopal Church for today's enlightening conversation with Peter Beinart. Welcome. Our church, with its rich history of resilience and faith, has always been a beacon of hope for open dialogue and community engagement. Founded in 1846 by a layperson, William Lambert, and others, St. Matthew's mission faced early challenges, including the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, in which folks would be waiting outside of the doors looking for fugitive slaves. That led to its temporary closure. Revived in 1880, it established formal ties with the Protestant Episcopal Church in Michigan and has since been a place of refuge and upward mobility for many Blacks during the Great Migration. St. Joseph's Church began in 1883 as a commemorative chapel gifted by Mrs. Lucetta Medberry, the widow of Samuel Medberry, a former mayor of Detroit. This building in which we are currently sitting was designed by architect James Nettleton, showcasing English Gothic style with very intricate designs, as you can see on the panels above you. Carrara marble at the altar, and the Reredos screens designed in Germany. In 1971, St. Matthew's, which was Detroit's oldest Black Episcopal congregation, merged with the predominantly white congregation of St. Joseph's Episcopal Church, and we became affectionately known as Matty Joe's. This merger reinforced our commitment to unity and community service, a combined history of almost 180 years. Our clergy and people have stood up for civil rights and anti-war activism and for LGBT rights and inclusion. Today, we remain as a house of worship, artistic beauty, resilience, and resistance, serving God and each other for a better world. Today, as we gather in this historic edifice, we are honored to host Peter Beinart, who will share insights from his latest work, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. His bold, urgent appeal resonates with all concerned about our collective future, challenging narratives, and encouraging us to reflect deeply on issues of justice and humanity. It is my prayer that the spirit of this place, the spirit of St. Matthew's and St. Joseph's, will infuse you with the energy that you need to be change agents in the world, a spirit rooted in faith, fellowship, the pursuit of justice and righteousness, and the dignity of all persons. Again, welcome to St. Matthew's and St. Joseph's Church.
Thank you so very much. Nabil, you want to come up? Oh. Keep going? Okay. So welcome, everybody. My name is Barbara Bearfield. This is Nabil Seder. We've been working for months to have this opportunity to bring Peter Beinart to you. And I wanted to just thank a few of the sponsors and also make sure you know that there are lots of refreshments after the presentation and a book signing. So right back there is a social area, and Book Beats is here with books, and you can have them signed. We also have cards for questions and answers. So if you have a question, 3x5 cards we'll pass them out if you don't have them, but they were in the front. So I want to thank the people that have some of our co-sponsors real quickly. Huntington Wood Peace Group, FASNA, Friends of Sabil North America, of course, Congregation Tahia, which has really helped us with organizing this. St. David's Episcopal Church. Take my glasses off to read it. Bookbeat, of course, and First United Methodist Church of Ferndale, where Congregation Tahia is stationed, and also the MLK Committee. We thank you. And of course, we thank St. Matthew's and St. Joseph's Episcopal Church for allowing us to use this historic place, this sacred place for this event today. So let me just introduce now, because we already got a little preview of who Peter Beinart is. Let me introduce the person who will be in conversation with him, who's very, very comfortable with the stage because he helped to organize the MLK days over the years. Abayomi Azikiwe is a graduate of Wayne State University, and he's worked for decades for various community organizations. He has consistently opposed the war policies of the United States in Western Asia, Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe. Azikiwe has been an activist in support of the Palestinian struggle for freedom and independence. He is a co-author of a pamphlet entitled Zionism, the Myths, the Lies, and the Crimes, along with anti-Zionist Jewish activist David Saul. Over the years, Azikiwe has served in the leadership positions with Moratorium Now Coalition, the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice, MCOWI, the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights, MCHR, along with many other organizations. He is the founder and publisher of the Pan-African News Wire, an electronic press agency on Africa and international affairs, founded in 1998. So we are so pleased to welcome our speakers to up here, Peter. And do you want to say anything, Raphael?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. What? Yeah, I have it here for him. I'm going to talk to him about it. Give me 1 second. Again, my name is Nabil Sater, and my co-pilot here, Barbara Harvey. I've been a member of JVP for.
Except that it's Barbara Bearfield.
Oh my God! I keep saying. I don't know why I keep saying this. Sorry, Barbara Bearfield. So I've been a member of JVP for 18 years, and I think Barbara Bearfield has been maybe a couple of years before me. So we've been working, we do a lot of, try to do a lot of programs, bring insightful speakers to kind of enlighten this world, this dark world we live in today, especially in these days. And when Barbara told me that we're going to have it at St. Matthew's and St. Joseph, and I looked it up and I said, I can't believe this is amazing because it's a historical church, the civil rights movement, Black movement, and I want to thank also Abayomi for moderating the talk here. Of course, Peter for being here with us, and thank you all for coming. I hope we're going to learn something from this. I hope that our hope is to create a coalition of the oppressed, for lack of better words, of marginalized, between Palestinians, indigenous, Blacks, Latinos, LGBTQ, all those things together,
And
because
Jews.
because this country, I think someone reminded me sitting in the back that I told him I'm going to take the country back, and he said we never had it. Correct. So we never had this. So it's never had something that. So we need to be very vigilant, especially in what is happening in the last 3-4 days, as you guys must have heard about the arrest on campus. And so the tyranny is amazing. Tyranny is happening is amazing, and we have to take a stand. And thank you so much for this occasion here. And I hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank everyone. Good afternoon. Can you hear me now? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to first of all thank Peter Beinart for coming here. He has a lot to say, particularly in regard to his latest work on the situation in Palestine since October 7th of 2023. We know all across the United States, there's been many protests, rallies, encampments, letters to the editor, all types of opposition to the genocide that is taking place, is ongoing in Palestine. And it's been very refreshing to see so many Jewish Americans that have come out in protest against what the Israeli government is doing, has been doing over the last year and a half. We saw the impact of the situation in Palestine on the elections back in November. We have a new administration now, Donald Trump, and the situation is not any better. In fact, he has proposed even another scheme for ethnic cleansing of Gaza, turning it into a resort area for people to come and have fun and then relocate the population to another area. So we have a lot to discuss today. I just want to thank everyone for coming in and joining with us. And Peter, I want you to first of all talk about your background as a journalist and how that impacts your work today as someone who has been critical of the state of Israel and its policies, as well as the United States.
Sure, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I was just occurred to me yesterday that I never, until I wrote a book about being Jewish, I'd never spent so much time in churches. But it's really a pleasure and an honor to get to be in this extraordinary space. I also just want to say that I feel like I'm always really grateful when people come to these events to listen to me who disagree from whatever perspective. I feel like there's a tendency for people to only come and listen to people they agree with. And so I'm always, if you're going to hear something from me that you really dislike, then I'm actually particularly grateful to you for having come. There's a line from the Mishnah, from the oldest part of the Talmud, which says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." So I always feel like if there's someone listening to me who really disagrees, then they're showing the greatest degree of wisdom. My views about this subject have evolved over the course of my life. I think that I was raised in a family in which we thought about what Israel meant to Jews in the context of Jewish safety after the Holocaust, and also as a kind of place that Jews had come to from many different parts of the world, that created a kind of a Jewish civilization, a Jewish culture that was very meaningful to my father, to my grandfather, and was meaningful to me when I started visiting there as a child. But I'm really, but really until my 30s, and I'm kind of embarrassed that it took so long in my life, but it was really not until my 30s that I think I really began to reckon with what the state of Israel meant to Palestinians, as the famous Palestinian intellectual Edward Said said, Zionism from the standpoint of its victims. And that was, for me, the beginning of a process that's taken me in places that I really would not have expected to go, of recognizing that as journalists, we very frequently in the United States have a certain kind of Jewish story is very commonly discussed in the United States, and the story of Jewish persecution, the story of Jewish suffering. And yet the story of Palestinian oppression and suffering and expulsion, and indeed now, as you said, of genocide, often is much less surfaced in the mainstream media. I think one of the reasons it's less surfaced, I think there are a number of reasons. Partly, I think it's the tremendous Islamophobia in the United States, especially in the wake of 9/11, that tends to lead to the dehumanization of Palestinians, even though, of course, not all Palestinians are Muslim. I also think that confronting the Palestinian story of Israel is very challenging for many Americans who are invested in our own myths about the United States. because Israel's founding myths and America's founding myths are very similar, of a kind of promised land forged on a hostile frontier. And so if you start asking uncomfortable questions about what Israel has done to the population that the Zionists found when they started to come to this land in the late 19th and early 20th century, it raises some pretty uncomfortable questions about the United States and the way the United States was formed as a settler colonial project. I think that's another reason that the Palestinian story is so often kind of submerged. But for me, understanding what Israel and has meant to Palestinians and what has done to Palestinians has been, for me, forced me to rethink what it means to be Jewish in some really fundamental ways. And I've been very, very grateful for the many Palestinian teachers and friends that I've had who have helped me understand a series of things that I didn't understand growing up and have not distanced me or alienated me from being Jewish. They've simply allowed me to rethink, to recast what it means to care about my people, to care about the Jewish people in a way that allows me to be in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom.
Interesting. Yeah, because here in the United States, there's also a myth that is taught in the public schools that, of course, there was no one here or very few people here.
Exactly.
And that if the British and also the French and the Spanish and the Dutch, well, particularly the what became the Americans, if they hadn't have come in and taken over North America, it would be a barren land, so on and so forth. So we have the same myth in Southern Africa. In South Africa, for example, this was the myth, and in Namibia, that it was the whites who came in and brought development, civilization, and so forth. So there is a parallel in regard to the historical myths that are promoted in that regard. What is your view in terms of the mass media in this country? I like to say corporate media. For example, Newsweek used to work for them, and Washington Post and so forth. They have been staunch, you know, in their defense of the state of Israel. And what do you think that's based on? Is that based on political considerations, economic considerations, or what?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there are exceptions. You mentioned the Washington Post, for instance. Karen Attiah at the Washington Post, I think, has written some really, really valuable columns about Palestinian rights and about what Israel's doing. But you're right. I think in the main, there is still not really what Edward Said called kind of permission to narrate for Palestinians, to basically tell their own story in the mainstream media. I think I think that's partly, again, because the kind of Zionist story is more comfortable in ways, especially for white Americans, given the stories we tell about the United States. In general, the American media is always more reluctant to look at human rights abuses that are committed by America's allies, and more comfortable to look at human rights abuses that are committed by America's adversaries, whether it's Russia or China or whoever. And there tends to be more of a kind of sense of justification. I also think that there is an anxiety in mainstream media about being called anti-Semitic. And it bothers me a lot. I mean, anti-Semitism is a genuine thing. It's a genuine problem. It's led to genocide. It still exists today. It's actually being fueled by Donald Trump in a lot of ways. But tragically, what happens sometimes is that establishment Jewish organizations, because they fear a certain kind of discourse about what Israel's doing or the exposure of certain kind of things, they use charges of anti-Semitism in order to try to intimidate journalists or other people from actually from bringing out bringing those things to light. And that's something that it's deeply troubling to me, that people would use a language of accusing people of bigotry when they're only simply trying to expose things that would lead us towards greater equality. Bigotry is the opposite of equality. So if people are doing work that showcases the need for human equality, that's not bigotry, it's actually the opposite of bigotry. So I think those are some of the reasons. I do think the good news is that a lot of Palestinians and their supporters have used to great effect social media as it has grown because they have been some ways marginalized in mainstream media, and especially among younger people, as you know, that's where a lot of people get their news, and I think that's why we see this generational divide among Americans on their attitudes towards this question.
Great. But what I've noticed also on a lot of social media platforms is that they are engaging in censorship as well. For example, certain Palestinian solidarity organizations have had their accounts shut down, like on Instagram and other sources. So it's an ongoing struggle.
Yes.
Just to mention the Washington Post, which is now owned by Jeff Bezos,
Right.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
I was just reading a report the other day saying that they only want to write editorials that deal with libertarian issues and
Yes.
issues that advocate, quote, free speech, unquote, meaning
Yes.
right-wing racist speech will not be censored. So it's a serious problem in this country. The BBC, for example, which covers international news, have a cable network.
Yeah.
I watch them a lot. In October of 2020, I was so outraged with their coverage of what was going on in Palestine. I have actually filed a complaint against them. I'm not even a British citizen, but I did file a complaint against them. They didn't want to respond to it. Eventually they did, but they had a lot of people that resigned from their network. People were throwing blood at their offices and so forth. So I think it's a major issue right now in terms of the role of the media.
I mean, it's funny you mention, look, part of the problem in the media is a general problem in American society, which is when almost all the wealth is going to a very, very small number of people at the top, right? Then what happens is the way that media institutions try to sustain themselves is by getting those small number of people at the top to basically pay the bills, right? And that makes you very dependent and reliant on those people. So when Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or whoever these people say, uh-oh, I don't want to be on the wrong side of Donald Trump because I don't want Donald Trump to go after me, then basically they can kind of cripple these news organizations. Whereas if news organizations are dependent on a broad swath of Americans, who have enough money to pay a little bit of money to sustain the institution, then you don't have to worry about the whims of these billionaires. But unfortunately, we don't really have an economy that sustains that.
Exactly. And what angered me was the accentuation of the Israeli state voices at the exclusion of the Palestinians, and the language that was being used, calling Palestinians subhumans, murderers, rapists, all this type of language that was being used that was not being refuted by the host of these networks. So I saw that as a serious problem. But what happened was that people moved into the streets and got involved in demonstrations. The students were taking over areas and spaces on campuses. How do you feel the media covered the demonstrations that took place over the last year and a half? What is your assessment of it?
I mean, I think that oftentimes the media coverage tended to focus on secondary issues rather than the central issue, right? I mean, the protest movements were designed to try to change U.S. policy and to change the policies of these universities. So it seems to me the right thing to focus on would have been those policies, right?
Right.
What is America's policies of selling weapons to Israel? It's actually in violation of U.S. law because we have something called the Leahy Law, which says that we're not supposed to be able to sell weapons to any foreign military that is found to be committing gross human rights violations, right? But in the case of Israel, the State Department doesn't even do the documentation that would allow it to know which units of the Israeli military were doing that. Or if they want a divestment from the university's pension funds, then the story should be about, well, what are the universities invested in, right? Who is that supporting, these kind of things. Instead, I think there was a tremendous amount of focus on the question of whether these protests were anti-Semitic. And I think that it is definitely true, because I spent a lot of time on college campuses. There were many Jewish students who felt very uncomfortable as a result of these protests. And there were even times, I think sometimes, where I think those protests crossed a line. For instance, I was at Columbia University for a whole day, and one of the slogans that I heard students chanting was, "Settlers, settlers, go home, Palestine is ours alone," referring to all Israeli Jews. And I thought that was, for me, that's fundamentally wrong. I believe that Israeli Jews and Palestinians should live together equally, under the same law with historical justice. I don't believe in expelling anybody. But I think that the media didn't often make a good enough distinction between the fact that the protests might have made some students uncomfortable and whether it was making them unsafe. Because being made uncomfortable because you're hearing things that are different than what you grew up with is not the same as being unsafe. Jewish students, like all students, have the right to be safe. They shouldn't be subject to, obviously, attacks or intimidation or violence. But universities are supposed to make you uncomfortable, right? That's kind of what education is about, right? Like, just like a kid might come from a very, very conservative evangelical family where they were raised to have a certain view about LGBT rights or about abortion, and they come to college campus and they're very uncomfortable to have those views interrogated, right? That's education, right? And a lot of Jewish students grew up in families where they never really heard a Palestinian perspective. They never learned anything about the Nakba, what happened to Palestinians in 1948. So it is really difficult for them to hear these things challenged when they were raised to believe that Israel was this kind of really, really pure country that only did good things. But what I think the media should have done, and what I think universities should have done, is said, we're going to try to curate this conversation. It's going to be uncomfortable for you, but that's okay, because that's how you're going to grow. And actually, there have been, as you were saying, a lot of Jewish students, many of whom might not have heard these things in their synagogues and their families growing up, who came to campus, encountered Palestinian students, took courses on the history of Israel and Palestine, and changed their views, right, and became advocates of Palestinian liberation. And I think the media didn't do a good enough job of covering that.
Yes, and we saw here in the state of Michigan the breaking up of two encampments at Wayne State University, and before that at the University of Michigan. There was also one at Michigan State, which was not broken up. But today, some of those same student activists are being prosecuted by the state attorney general.
Yes.
These are free speech issues. People have a right to assembly. There was no violence as far as I could see. I was at the one at Wayne State, and even though the university administration shut down the campus and said people had to work from home or online or whatever. So it's very interesting. Columbia University, you mentioned, I understand yesterday or day before they had a grant for $400 million from the federal government that was canceled because they said the administration was not doing enough to combat anti-Semitism. What is your response to that?
Look, I think the first thing to say is that the idea that Donald Trump and his administration are really concerned about anti-Semitism is laughable, right? I mean, Donald Trump has made more statements that traffic in anti-Semitic stereotypes than any American president in modern history. In 2016, he ran an ad that was probably the most anti-Semitic ad an American major presidential candidate ever run, where he basically showed these pictures of three prominent Jewish figures and then basically said, you know, they're responsible for destroying the global economy and immiserating ordinary Americans, right? This is a guy who's hung out with openly anti-Semitic white nationalists, right, who said that Charlottesville was a bunch of good people when they were neo-Nazis, right? I mean, so it's a pretext, right? Plus, the idea that Columbia hasn't done enough. I mean, Columbia suspended Students for Justice in Palestine. It suspended Jewish Voices for Peace. It suspended and punished so many of students. I mean, Columbia University has basically been doing has massively cracked down on pro-Palestinian speech, right, in the name of anti-Semitism. So this is a pretext. I think what's really going on here is that Donald Trump wants to create an authoritarian regime. And if you want to create an authoritarian regime, you crack down on those institutions that are not under your control, and especially those ones that can create dissent, right? So inside the federal government, he's cracking down on the Justice Department, basically turning them into his private lawyers, right? Because rather than having a Justice Department that's supposed to follow the rule of law. He's attacking independent media, right? Because they're not under his control. And universities are not under his control, and there are places that throughout American history have been places that have created dissent against people in power. So he wants to cripple them, right? He wants to domesticate them. He wants to say, I don't think he wants to make them not exist. He doesn't care if you go to get a computer science degree or whatever, go to work at Goldman Sachs, but he wants to prevent them from being places that do what universities are supposed to do, which is foster critical discourse and get people to ask hard questions about people in power, because he doesn't want people asking those hard questions and organizing against him. And that's what this is really about. And it's shameful to me to see the way that some prominent Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, which claims to be a civil rights organization, right, is basically cheering on this assault on America's universities and on American liberal democracy itself, which is not a good thing for Americans and it's not a good thing for Jews.
So what was the response to Trump's proposal for Gaza among mainstream Jewish American organizations? I was wondering when he made the proposal, I said, seemed like that's would contradict, what the Zionist ideology promotes. What do you think about their response, like the ADL and others?
The response has been very, very mealy-mouthed. It has not been what it should be, which is horror and full-throated opposition, right? I mean, this would be like one of the great crimes of the 21st century, right? Expelling, 2 million people from their homes. And these are, as you know, these are people whose families who are already from refugee families. Right. Most of them are not from Gaza. Their families were expelled in 1948 from what's now Israel, right? So, and now you've destroyed the place. You've just laid waste to it, right? With American weapons, most of the buildings, the hospitals, the schools, the agriculture, the bakeries, the churches and mosques, mostly destroyed, right? And you say, oh my gosh, it looks like it's really terrible there, right? Those people should be forced to leave, right? The truth is, many people in Gaza would like to leave. They would like to go back to the places their families are from, right? Which are now in Israel, right? Which they should have the right to do, right? And live equally alongside Jews. But of course, that's not even on the table. And so Trump comes up with this idea. Very mainstream people in Israel, not just the Israeli right like Benjamin Netanyahu, but Netanyahu's kind of centrist opponents like Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz endorsed the idea. And a lot of American Jewish organizations said, well, we don't know how it would work. It seems like it might not be practical. There are a lot of questions, but, maybe we need some out-of-the-box thinking. This is a new paradigm. It's creative. I mean, this is monstrous, right? Like, and to me, it just shows there's something fundamentally wrong here. Like, the organized American Jewish community doesn't have the ability to say, this is wrong. Right? What happens so often with these institutions, Jewish organizations, is whatever Israel does, they then find some post hoc justification for, right? And so if before Trump's plan, if you had said, we think that Israel might be planning a mass expulsion, people would have said, these institutions would have said, how dare you slander Israel that way? How can you accuse them? How could you suggest that they would do such a thing? And then when Trump suggested, and Netanyahu and other Israeli politicians embraced it, people say, well, nothing else was working, so why don't we give this a try?
Wow, amazing. Well, I wanted to get your take on a solution to the Palestinian question. I understand that you promote the idea of a one-state solution, like South Africa, what happened in South Africa during the 1990s, what happened in Namibia, which is right next to South Africa in the 1990s, where it was a settler, colonial, racist, apartheid system. It was broken down through mass demonstrations and protests and sanctions, and they had multi-party elections. And the solution was a one-state solution. So have you met a lot of pushback in your writing calling for a one-state solution?
Yeah, I think that it's funny, a lot of people who say to me, I can't believe you support a one-state solution, this kind of in Jewish spaces. And sometimes I say, I want to say, but you support a one-state solution too. You support the one-state solution we have now, right? Which even Israel's own human rights organizations say is an apartheid system, right? So we don't disagree really about some of you may claim you support two states, but you don't actually act like that because you never do anything to try to stop settlement growth, which makes a Palestinian state impossible. So in reality, we both support one state. The question is that I support a one state where everyone has citizenship and the right to vote and is treated equally, right? You support one state where where some of the Palestinians are second-class citizens and most of them can't become citizens at all, right? And you think that's going to work out better for Jews, right? But my argument is it's not, because when you deny people basic human rights, you are inflicting a tremendous amount of violence on them. You may be blind to that violence. You may not see it, but it's there every day. And when you inflict all that violence on people, it endangers everybody. And the reason South Africa is not a perfect place now. It's still a place with very profound inequalities and problems. But it is actually, it is a much safer place for everybody than it would have been if apartheid had continued for another 25 years. Because the violence of the system of apartheid inflicted tremendous violence on Black South Africans, and it also produced armed resistance, right, by Black South Africans. The ANC was not a nonviolent organization, right? It was getting weapons from the Soviet Union. It was fighting back, right? And white South Africans were terrified of Mkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the ANC. But when Black South Africans got the vote, Mkhonto we Sizwe ceased to exist because Black South Africans didn't need to be in armed rebellion anymore, right? And that's why the place became safer for everybody. And that's why I believe that legal equality produces a society that is safer for everybody.
Yeah, in fact, Mkhonto we Sizwe was merged with the South African Defense Forces, those who wanted to stay, and they created the South African National Defense Forces. They had problems initially, but it seems to be going pretty good right now.
Right, and I just want to pause on a second because for most Israeli Jews, I think less so for Palestinians, but for most Israeli Jews, it would be impossible for them to imagine a military that had a Palestinian general, a Jewish general, a Palestinian colonel, right? It was like, Peter, what are you smoking that you could possibly believe that, right? But that was the same way that white South Africans felt. They couldn't imagine a military that would have black officers and white officers, and Americans in the early 20th century, even the mid-20th century, they couldn't imagine a U.S. military in which white soldiers would be taking orders from black officers, but it was possible, right? A mass movement made it possible, and we're all better for it.
Exactly, exactly. So I think we need to open up the floor for some comments and questions. We have some Palestinian elders here. We want to hear from Dr. Ishmael Noor. We have Ishmael. We have others. Hassan Nawash is here. Yes. But Nabil, yes. You had a question. Do you want to ask your question to Peter?
I can answer it. I can. We know Nabil and I are having this conversation. So one of the things Nabil wants me to speak about, which is totally fine, is what I call cultural Zionism, right? So Zionism is a term that understandably provokes extremely very, very, very painful term for Palestinians, given what Israel has done since 1948. For Jews, it's a complicated term. It has a lot of kind of vague but kind of intimate meanings. The reason that I think there is a cultural Zionist tradition that's valuable is that there were a group of thinkers in the 1930s and 40s who believed, like Martin Buber, Judah Magnus, Hannah Arendt, Albert Einstein, who believed in a flourishing Jewish community that would speak Hebrew in Palestine, in mandatory Palestine, but opposed a Jewish state, who believed in one equal binational state. That was not the Zionism that won out in 1948. It's not the Zionism that existed in 1948. But I think it's important to talk about that tradition when I talk to other Jews, because so often in Jewish discourse, the idea is if there's not a Jewish supremacist state, then there won't be any Jews there. Or Jews can't flourish, they can't speak Hebrew, they can't have those communities. And to me, it's important to remind people that there were people who actually had exactly that view, who opposed the Jewish state and believed that Jews could flourish and speak Hebrew and live in and practice their culture under conditions of legal equality.
Okay. All right. Hassan, do you have any contribution?
It occurs to me that the fear of cultural Zionism, not for Palestinians, is weird because the golden age of Jews is in Spain under the Arabs. And Maimonides, I'm sure you're familiar with him, he comes from that tradition. So it's not new in terms of describing the harmonious relationship and the thriving relationship of Jews to Arab Muslims.
Yes.
So it's a long shot, but in North Africa, when the Inquisition actually happened, and routing all Jews and all Muslims from Spain.
Yes.
They escaped into North Africa,
Yes.
and also all the way back to Istanbul in Turkey. So
Yes.
I don't want to go on. I mean,
Yeah.
this is not
Yeah.
my lecture,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I wanted to point that out. But
Yes.
one more thing, though,
Yes.
and
Yes.
I will
Yes.
stop.
Yes.
Magnus
Yes.
and Buber were the minority, and they ended up tagging along with Ben Gurion and others in actually insisting on a Jewish state in the 1930s. The ethnic cleansing was clear, actually propagated by the mainstream Zionists in the 30s. And the cultural Zionists were a minority, they were stamped. Fine, but what am I supposed to do as a Palestinian
Right.
with the arming of the Haganah, et
Yes.
cetera, et cetera?
Yes.
But
Yes.
that's all.
Yes. Thank you. There's so much there. I mean, Buber, to be fair to Buber, Buber did testify against partition, against the creation of a Jewish state in 1947, because I think he foresaw that it would lead to, as Palestinians did, that it would lead to an act of mass ethnic cleansing, this creation of a Jewish state. But you're right, the cultural Zionists were a tiny minority, and the mainstream were people who supported a Jewish state and had been talking, as you said, about the idea of expulsion, because you couldn't create a Jewish state without mass expulsion. There just weren't enough Jews there, right? Even in the partition plan of 1947, even in the state that was allocated to the Jews, somewhere between 40 and 50% of the population of the Jewish state were Palestinians, and they lived on most of the land. So you couldn't, Ben Gurion said it has to have an 80% Jewish majority. Well, how's it going to have an 80% Jewish majority unless you force a lot of these people off of their land? I think that your point about that history is really, really important. That history, my own grandmother, who was born in Egypt, and traces her ancestry to Spain, in some ways is the product of that history. I think what's happened, which is really tragic, is that the emergence of the Zionist movement and the creation of the State of Israel created a dynamic in which these Jewish communities in these Arab and Muslim lands, in Morocco, in Iraq, in Yemen, beyond, basically, being an Arab Jew became all of a sudden like a dichotomy, right? Because once Zionism and the Jewish state was speaking in the name of Jews, right, it all of a sudden became much harder to be both Arab and Jew. And so today in Israel, right, it's common that people will be referred to as Moroccan Jews or Iraqi Jews or Yemeni Jews, but not as Arab Jews, right? And many of them weren't even able to pass on Arabic to their children because there was so much stigma associated with speaking Arabic in Israel. It was like that there's a great book about this by the Iraqi, Israeli, British journalist Rachel Shabi about Mizrahi Jews, what they call Eastern Jews in Israel, called We Look Like the Enemy, right? And it's basically about how these people had to kind of like expunge the Arabness in themselves in order to be accepted in Israel, especially the Israel of the 50s, which was very dominated by European Ashkenazi Jews who had very racist attitudes towards the Jews from the Arab world, right? And so instead of having this population of Jews from the Arab world who could be a bridge, right, who could say, we lived alongside in Arab and Muslim societies and communities, and we can do that here, you have this terrible dynamic in which oftentimes it's Mizrahi Jews who often end up being even further to the right politically in Israel than Jews of European descent. The backbone of the Likud party are Jews of who trace their ancestry from Arab and Muslim lands. And I think that's one of the terrible and ironic consequences of this really awful history.
Dr. Noor.
Thank you, Peter, and I am Abayomi. The problem and the confusion among us, all of us, is that we concentrate on the details of the conflict in Palestine. I said conflict, which is against my belief. It is not a conflict, it is an occupation. So we get lost in the details, so people do not focus on the main issue and the main reason for the problem in there. Since the start, the people of Palestine noticed and understood that this is a colonial, Zionist, settler project. And we say project because it is not ended yet. It has expanded since the start of this project. So that allows everybody to question, for example, the incumbent motivation on campuses in the United States, whether they are right or wrong, but they do not say anything about the Palestinians. On the other side, we have been bombarded since the start with lots of fabrications, lies, and what have you. So that is another problem. One more problem in there is, the real problem in there is that the Zionist ideology is based on converting religion into nationality. So they refer to Jews as a nationality, which is not. I am a sociologist, and I know what nationality is, what the component of being a national movement is, and since it is a colonial Zionist settler project, and with those lies and things like that, Katie Hilber asked me in one of the interviews that she made with me and the late Renee Littman a few months ago, what is liberation to you? What does it mean? I said to her, that is my response. Liberation to me is when the Palestinians refugees are able to go back to their homes in their towns and their farms, which my father is an example to me when he was kicked out from his farm in Palestine, 1948, although I am not from that part of Palestine. So when they go back and practice their self-determination, they can decide on what to do in Palestine. Of course, it is going to be one state, but not under the circumstances that we are discussing right now, and maybe I can elaborate later on. Thank you.
Okay.
Sure, I would disagree about the question of whether Jews constitute a people. I think most Jews do think of themselves not just as a religion like Christianity and Islam, but as we say in Hebrew, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, right? And I think most Israeli Jews think of themselves as a collective group. I don't think that, Afrikaners in South Africa also thought of themselves as a collective group, right? Not only a religious group. It doesn't, right, and still do. It doesn't entitle you to any legal supremacy, right? To think about yourself as a group with a culture, and for Jews to think of themselves as a nation, although again, there are arguments about this among Jews, but many Jews do think about themselves as a people. And when people think about themselves as a people, I don't think it's particularly productive to deny their self-conception as a people, right? Just as I think it's reprehensible when people deny that Palestinians are a people. But I think the critical question is, your sense of yourself as a people doesn't give you any rights that are greater than anybody else. And I would agree with you that I would look forward to the day in which Palestinians can return to the places from which they were expelled, and live peacefully and equally alongside the Jews who were there.
Right. Could you give us your name? Go ahead, ask your question.
Oh, yeah, thank you, David Kelton. I wanted to ask about the breakdown, unfortunately, of Black-Jewish relations. We have a handful of dissident Jews here who, unfortunately were marginalized and disliked by our own community. But, now, the rise of Trump, and you think there's a lot of Jews who are at the forefront of pushing against DI, of hard-handed police tactics, bringing back stop and frisk. Even Trump himself was, to some extent, largely rehabilitated by Jews who were scared. And what does that mean for the breakdown of Black-Jewish relations, or just a handful of us dissident Jews that are here today?
Thanks. When I think about this question about the debates among Jews in the United States about our safety and about our self-interest, I often think about this moment in South African history at a famous trial that was called the Rivonia trial. And it was at the Rivonia trial that Mandela was convicted and then sent to prison for many, many decades. One of the interesting things from the Jewish perspective about the Rivonia trial is that all of the white defendants at the Rivonia trial were Jews. And the prosecutor for the apartheid state was also Jewish. And in a way, between the prosecutor, Percy Utar, who was also the head of the president of a large Orthodox synagogue in Johannesburg, and these Jewish communists who were standing in the dock alongside Mandela and their black comrades, was kind of a debate about where Jewish safety lay, right? For Percy Utar, Jews were safe if Jews allied with those people who were in power, right, with racist and authoritarian systems of oppression, that would keep Jews safe. And I think that's basically the bet that certain people, Miriam Adelson or whoever else, all people, Jared Kushner, this is the bet that people have made with Donald Trump, right? That they call America a Judeo-Christian country, that Trump focuses his hostility on Muslims, on immigrants, on black people, on LGBT people, and that Jews will be safe by making an alliance with this kind of white Christian nationalism, right? And then there are people like you, right? Or I was just learned earlier today that of the 11 kids who are being prosecuted now for being at that encampment in Michigan, 6 of them are Jewish, right? 6 of them, a majority, right? They are the moral descendants of those Jews who were prosecuted alongside Mandela in the Rivonia trial. And they have a different conception of Jewish safety. And their conception is that Jews are safe when Jews fight with whoever is oppressed, right, for their liberation and their freedom, right? And it is in that common struggle, right, that we make ourselves safe, right? And that was also the debate among Jews during the Civil Rights Movement, because as I mentioned the other day, when Abraham Joshua Heschel went to Selma to march with Dr. King, he was met by a group of Southern rabbis at the airport who told him to turn around and go home because he would endanger Southern Jews if he supported the Civil Rights Movement, right? And that was also a debate among Jews about what keeps us safe, right? I believe that Jews are safe when we struggle alongside any group of people that is suffering oppression, and that everyone needs to fight together against this new terrifying form of racism and authoritarianism that's rising in America today.
All right. I have some written questions. We have about maybe 20, 25 minutes more. Someone writes, billions of dollars of American taxes have supported genocide in Gaza and Israeli violence in Palestine. How can we end this complicity? Can you speak about the potential power of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah.
It's too fast? Okay. All right. Billions of dollars, can you hear me now? Billions of dollars of American taxes have supported a genocide in Gaza and Israeli violence in Palestine. Asking Peter, how can we end the complicity, and can you speak about the potential power of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement?
Well, I think the movement that we've seen, I mean, obviously the BDS movement goes back to 2005, but the movement especially I think we've seen on college campuses and beyond over the last 15 months has already contributed to a pretty substantial shift in American public opinion among Democrats and among independents, not as much among Republicans, but Gallup just came out with a poll last week, And if you look at the graph, it's quite remarkable, actually. The pace at which views among Democrats and independents are shifting on this question. It's a really dramatic turn that's taken place. I think the question is, how can that translate into the political system? Because we have a political system that on a lot of issues is often very resistant to public opinion, right? I mean, if public opinion translated into American policy, we would have had gun control a long time ago, right? Most Americans want that. And our political system is not becoming more democratic, it's becoming less democratic, right? And so I think the question is whether the energy that has been built up in this movement for Palestinian freedom can enter into the political process and change at least the Democratic Party. So we don't have another president like Joe Biden if the Democrats ever gain power. And I think it's not, there's not a foregone conclusion. We don't know, but I think there is a possibility. I think that if you look at the way the anti-war movement during Vietnam then led to Eugene McCarthy's campaign in 1968 and George McGovern's campaign, which won the Democratic nomination in 1972, and then elected the Democrats in 1974 to Congress, who ended American military funding for the war in Vietnam. You see the way a social movement can enter into the political process. If you look at the way the Occupy movement created the energy that led to Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016, Sanders didn't win, but Sanders did change the economic debate inside the Democratic Party. And so what I hope is that in 2028, some Democratic politician will look at this issue and say, I'm running against all these guys who are basically like sounding like they're reading off AIPAC's talking points, but I know that's not what most Democrats actually believe. And for my own political self-interest, I can take a position that ends Israeli impunity, a position that is forthrightly in support of Palestinian human rights, and that I can actually benefit from that because I can bring all of this energy into my campaign. And I think if a Democratic politician has the courage to do that and the skill to do it, I actually think that they could transform the Democratic Party.
Another question. In your travels, have you encountered people who are totally outraged by the genocide that's going on in Palestine? And how do you deal with this as a Jewish American?
Well, yes, I do meet a lot of people who are outraged. I would like to think that I'm outraged myself. I mean, if the implication of the question is, are there people who are outraged by what Israel is doing and therefore that affects their idea about Jews, I guess what I would say is, I think it's very, very important to distinguish Israel as a state from Jews as a group of people, right? So just like it would not be fair to hold Chinese Americans responsible for what the People's Republic of China does, right? Or Muslim Americans responsible for what Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or whatever does, right? It's not fair to hold American Jews responsible for what Israel does, right? But the problem in the case of Jews in Israel is that while we rightly want people who don't like Israel to make that clear distinction, as they should, the Jewish organizations in America often don't make that distinction themselves, right? So Jewish leaders will often say something like, to be supportive of Israel or to be a Zionist is inherent in being Jewish. That's, first of all, it's just wrong. It's wrong because Judaism existed for literally centuries and centuries before the political Zionist movement, and there have always been Jews for a variety of reasons, not even only Jews on the left, by the way, who have been against Zionism. If you go to Brooklyn and you go to meet the Satmar Hasidim, right, they're profoundly anti-Zionist, right, and for a whole set of theological reasons that actually don't even have very much to do with what we're talking about, but they're certainly anti-Zionist, right, but they're certainly still Jews, right, and the problem is, though, when you say that Zionism and Judaism are the same thing, you're actually putting Jews at risk because you're conflating these two things that we need to keep separate.
All right, here's another question. Placing God at the notion that God works in mysterious ways, how does one maintain belief in the precept that the, quote, arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice? Dr. King used to say that. When countless greedy capitalists are financially benefiting from the wartime destruction of Gaza and Palestine, isn't the military-industrial complex an even more powerful driver of Mideast conflict than disparate religious ideologies?
Well, I think there's a kind of alliance or coalition, you could say, between those two things, right? I mean, between an ethno-nationalist ideology that has always, since its beginning, essentially wanted Israel to control the maximum amount of land with the fewest number of Palestinians, right? That's been the kind of thrust of Israel's policy since the very beginning, and you see that now, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, where there's a lot of ethnic cleansing that's happening, where Palestinians are being forced from entire villages. But yes, this is being funded, this is being armed by the United States, right? And there is a material self-interest for all of the companies that make these weapons in the United States, because basically the way America gives Israel weapons is we basically give Israel a big credit card paid for by U.S. tax dollars, and then Israel can use this credit card to go and buy weapons mostly from American weapons manufacturers, which is great for those weapons manufacturers' bottom line, right? It's not so good for American taxpayers, let alone for Palestinians. So does the arc of the moral universe bend towards justice? I don't know. You know, it depends on how long a time frame and a perspective we have. To me, I don't think that I can say that I know the answer to that question. What I know is that human beings have a moral obligation to do what they can to fight for justice in their own way, in their own time, recognizing that the long arc of history is much too big for us to really understand, let alone the mind of God. So that's not our job description. Our job description is simply to do what we can in our particular moment so we can answer for ourselves at the end of our days, whether we believe we're answering to a divine power or whether we just believe we're answering to our grandchildren, that we can answer for the way we acted, even recognizing that our own power is very limited.
Okay, I think we have about 2 more questions. This one is related to a Senate race that's taking place in Michigan next year, where someone named Stevens will be running. Would you rule her out based on the millions in AIPAC funding, voting to sanction the International Criminal Court for its going after Israeli leaders, for violating the Leahy law and funding billions of weapons to Israel, and disparaging Michigan pro-Palestinian voices that question her stance? So would that be enough to disqualify someone?
Yeah, it would for me. It would for me. Then the question is, can people who care, people who think those views as I do are wrong, like, can they find another candidate, right? And support that candidate so that candidate can be a legitimate contender to oppose someone like that. Yeah.
Okay, what are the best hopes for evolution of Jewish identity, independent from Zionism, given the strong anti-Islamic alliance of Zionists and evangelicals, which should anti-Zionists look for coalitions?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that Jews should look for coalitions with people who believe in human equality, who believe that all people are created with equal and infinite dignity, and and who want to struggle for the equal rights of all people. And I think those people in America tend to be disproportionately from groups of people who have suffered from oppression themselves, right? And so I think that's why our best allies will disproportionately come from Black communities, from Muslim communities, from LGBT communities, from immigrant communities, because those people have tasted that kind of oppression. But not only them, they're also going to be Americans of all different backgrounds who have that moral perspective. And I think that there can be a kind of anxiety among sometimes I find with some Jewish people, even when someone who's not Jewish says exactly the same thing that you say, it's harder to hear it than when you say it or when another Jewish person says it, right? Because you're like, oh, I don't know, why is this person so angry about the subject? Why are they so interested in this subject? Maybe there's some hidden anti-Semitic motivation here. And I think that that's why getting to know people is so important, to build those bonds of trust. And I think it's really, really important that all people be given the benefit of the doubt and treated with goodwill, right? This is what I find so frustrating and upsetting about the way that the discourse of anti-Semitism gets described by American Jewish organizations, that people are should be treated as innocent of anti-Semitism until proven guilty. The bar should be high, right? If you do a lot of things and show that you really have some hostility to Jews, as Jews, right? Okay, then you're not someone I'm going to ally with. And I don't care what your position on Israel is, for that matter. I'm not going to go and become friends with Tucker Carlson or with Candace Owens, right, who say all kinds of crazy anti-Semitic conspiracy things just because they don't like Israel. Sorry, they seem like they're trafficking anti-Semitism. But when people are just profoundly angry at the state of Israel, and they have good reason to be profoundly angry at the state of Israel because they care about the lives at stake there, then I think you should listen to those people, right, and give them the benefit of the doubt in recognizing that there's a moral outrage there that they're expressing about Israel, but in another time they would have been expressing about apartheid South Africa or about Vietnam or about slavery. And those are the people who have always powered the great movements in American history, right? Those are always the people that we rely on to create a better country and a better world.
Okay, well, this question, one of the last written ones, seems to ask the question, what organizations or political parties in Israel itself could join a coalition with the Palestinians for a new democratic order? Is that, can it be envisioned?
I mean, the problem in Israel itself, Israel proper, right, is that there are not real, there are Palestinian political parties and then there are Jewish political parties. And no party that is essentially a Jewish political party really supports Palestinian equality, right? Because in some ways, the whole notion of having a political party that is based on like one ethno-religious group itself undermines the whole point, right? The political parties need to bring together people of different backgrounds based on a set of common principles, right? And that's why so the most left-wing Jewish party was the Meretz Party, which is now joined with the Labor Party. And its leader of this new grouping, who's Yair Golan, who's considered to be on the Israeli Jewish left, when asked about Trump's plan, he said, it's impractical, but it's a beautiful dream, right? So this is not someone you can work with because it's not someone who believes in equality. It is the Palestinian parties, Hadash, the Communist Party, Balad, the Nationalist Party, Ram, the Islamist party, I'll leave to the side a little bit because I don't believe in Islamism or any kind of religiously informed political ideology. But those other Palestinian parties are the only ones in Israel that are actually advocating for equality. And so what I would like to see would be Jews joining into those parties, Hadash and Balad, so they become not only Palestinian, but also Palestinian and Jewish parties that are advocating for equality. Starting for advocating for equality inside the Green Line, inside Israel proper, but beyond that, for advocating for equality everywhere. So there's equality between Palestinians and Jews everywhere between the river and the sea.
All right, so are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, go ahead. Two questions.
I mean, unfortunately, the truth is that Israeli Jewish political leaders do represent Israeli Jews. I mean, if you look at public opinion, right, the vast majority of Israeli Jews support the system of apartheid and Jewish supremacy that exists now. And indeed, a majority of them, according to polls, support Trump's plan for mass ethnic expulsion. And as I try to argue in my book, this isn't really surprising. This isn't like a particularly Jewish thing. When people become accustomed to systems of legal supremacy, they associate their safety with that supremacy. That's the way white South Africans thought. It's the way Protestants in Northern Ireland thought. I've uncovered this quote from in my book from the Protestant leader Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland. And when they signed the Good Friday Accords that gave Catholics political equality, he called it a prelude to genocide. He said that Protestants in Northern Ireland were going to be victims of genocide, right, if Catholics got political equality. That's the way that many, many, many white Americans throughout the period of slavery and segregation saw it. Basically, they thought, we're on top now, but if black people aren't slaves, we're going to be the slaves. I mean, this was a common thing you heard in 19th century white discourse. So unfortunately, it's a typical kind of view, and it doesn't change until resistance movements put enough pressure and offer an alternative vision that begins to chip away at this. So some people begin to imagine, actually, that the liberation of people who are being oppressed will actually also liberate them from the burden of being oppressors.
One last question.
Yeah. 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 You know, there may be other people here who you know, again, because I'm not a Christian, who can speak with more knowledge about this than I can. Obviously, there's a particular theology that says that the Jews need to all ingather in the land of Israel so that you can have this Armageddon conflict between, you know, Gog and Magog, and then the Jews are going to die, but then it's going to bring Christ back. And again, it's something like, I probably am not getting entirely wrong. I think that seems to me part of it, but I'm also always a little uncomfortable when people talk just about Christian Zionism, because it seems to me to have so much to do with race as well, right? Because you look at public opinion among Christians in the United States, right? White Christians tend to be much more supportive of Israel than black Christians or, let's say, Hispanic Christians are, right? So there's something not only about Christianity going on, it's also, I think, about a racial view. And I think that, in general, I think that the Americans who are most deeply and firmly unwilling to reckon with America's own history of settler colonialism, right, are also the ones who are most hostile to any criticism of Israel, right? Because they see that, they identify with that story, that the Israel Zionist story, because they identify it with the American story. I actually found this statistic a couple years ago that I thought was really astonishing. And what it said was that in the 19th century in the United States, I don't know how they found this out, but the closer a white family was to the Indian frontier, to the native frontier, the more likely they were to give their child a biblical name, a name from the Hebrew Bible, right? And so you see this way in which, and you see that, I mean, you see if you just drive around America, right? You see how frequently we see names that come from the Hebrew Bible, in which the American colonists, settlers, right, were reenacting this idea, right, of the Israelite conquest of the land, right? And then they identify with Israel, which is also, in its own way, kind of reenacting this biblical conquest. And I think that's part of what makes this such a powerful ideological and kind of religious alliance. And the Americans, who because of their own experience, right, didn't find 19th century America to be such a benign and wonderful place, right, are going to be much more skeptical of this story. And I think it also tends to make them more skeptical of Israel as well.
All right.
As a Christian project. Yes. Yes, very, very good point. Yes, no, that's exactly right. Christian Zionism is older. Christian Zionism is older than Jewish Zionism. That's exactly right.
Wow. Okay, one last, and then Barbara can give us directions after that. Okay, go ahead, Nabil.
Actually, I usually don't ask the questions, but it's not a question, it's a comment. But for everyone here, and Peter, I should have asked you this before. So some of you already mentioned, so there are 21% of the population in what's called Israel proper, 1948, that are Palestinians.
Yes.
They're not out there killing Jews. That's number one. The second thing is, the more important part is I always tell people that if you are born in, forget 1948, let's go to 67. If you're born in the territory in 67, Gaza or the West Bank, the only Jew you know or you see is either a settler or a soldier.
Yes, yes.
These are the only two Jews you know. So if you're living in that space, why in the hell would you not hate them, right?
Right.
These are your oppressors. So the only reason I'm saying this in the context when you hear Jews around the world, here in the United States, and the Zionists, well, the Palestinians hate Jews. Well, if they hated Jews, they wanted to kill them. We can kill them here. Here's a Palestinian, here's a Jew. He could have killed them, but it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It only happens when people are oppressed. And I just want to, like I say, pick on that one here, that if you were in 67, give me one reason that they would like you.
Right. Yes. No, that's exactly right. I had a conversation with a Palestinian friend from the West Bank, and he told me this remarkable story. He said to me that he had been traveling, I think he was in the suburbs of Atlanta, and he saw a group of modern Orthodox Jews walking to synagogue on Shabbat, and he saw that they were not armed. And he said, I was so struck when I saw that they weren't carrying arms. And then it dawned on me that they didn't need to carry arms because they're not actually living in a system of oppression where they're oppressing their neighbors, right? And therefore they're afraid because of the results of this system of oppression, right? And that to me was like a kind of a vision, you know, of what relationships are like between Jews and Palestinians under conditions of equality, the kind of relations that exist here in Michigan, right? Which are so beautiful to watch. I've had the chance to witness them over the last couple of days as Barbara and Nabil have very kindly kind of like ferried me around, you know? And to me, that's the vision that I would like to see exist in Palestine and Israel too.
Some food, we'll pass it around back there, and buy a book, have Peter sign it, and we'll continue this conversation over some food. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay,
Thank you.
good to meet you.
Yeah, very nice to meet you.
Okay, great.